joining us on this Wednesday or Tuesday afternoon. Anyway, or midday, I guess it's not afternoon. Anyway, so let's talk about vegetable gardening. So first of all, just because I work for Colorado State University Extension, I do want to introduce you all to Extension. And basically what we are is the outreach arm of Colorado State University. So we provide you with information that you can use in your everyday life. And in our El Paso County office, we have a variety of services, including horticulture and master gardeners, which I lead that program. And then we have 4-H youth development, food safety and food preservation, and more. And so we do have a website that you can come and visit. And you can also register for classes at our Eventbrite pages. And so we've got lots and lots of classes on gardening, cottage foods, food preservation, a variety of different things. So if you please check that out if you are interested. But now let's get to the gardening. So when you're thinking about putting in a vegetable garden, one of the most important things is to pick a sunny spot. So it can be problematic if the best place in your yard is in deep shade, either the shade of your house or under a tree, because most vegetables actually require a minimum of 6 hours of sun, especially things like tomatoes or beans or squash or corn. If you do have an area that has less sun and that's your only place that you can garden, you could consider growing greens because you don't need as much sun for them. You can get away with as little as 2 hours a day. And so things like lettuce and kale and spinach, you might be able to get away with. So really kind of take a look in your yard where you might want to have that garden. Another thing to consider is that if you have a relatively big area, you want to put it close to your house because that will make it easier for you to tend to your garden and it won't kind of get a little bit out of sight, out of mind. And then also make sure it's close to some sort of water source. So preferably it would be near the hose in your, near your house, or just some sort of water source, because vegetables will need a great deal of water. So if you don't have a yard or a place to garden, that's totally fine. There's other ways that you can still garden. So you could try container gardening. And that you could put on a balcony of an apartment, or maybe even if you have a spot at work that you might be able to sweet talk the people at work into letting you have a little bit of a container garden. And so you do want to be when you're choosing a container, you want to you kind of almost the sky's the limit, that you can pretty much use anything that holds soil and drains. So it's got to have drainage. So it's got to have a hole poked in the bottom to drain. But a bigger container is a little bit better, because especially if you want to grow bigger plants like peppers and tomatoes. But you can go for a whole variety of different containers. So anything from a hanging basket, a whiskey barrel, window boxes even, and your materials can be terracotta, so just those heavy ceramic containers. They can be made out of plastic. They can be made out of a porcelain ceramic, or even like a fiberglass container. So there's lots and lots of options for container gardening, and that does not need to limit you if you don't have a big area where you can garden. Another option would be to look for a community garden near you. So there are a few places in the Colorado Springs area where you could rent a plot. There's a number of them have now gone defunct because there was an organizational change with the Pikes Peak Urban Gardens, but you still can find some of them that might be near you. So like the Charmaine Nyan Community Garden, or the West Side Community Center Garden, or the Old Farm Community Garden. So there are some options, and maybe more will come online. And you might have, there might even be the option to have one in your apartment complex. So that would be another thing that you could ask, is if you live in an apartment complex, maybe there's a little spot of land that's just devoted to lawn, and maybe that could become a little bit of a community garden. So now let's talk about some of the climate considerations that you have to deal with if you are gardening in Colorado. So there are other places in the country where it's easier to garden. Colorado kind of has some challenges. And so there's a variety of factors that affect your garden. And these include, and I'm gonna talk about these more in detail, but the frost-free days, our general temperatures, weather extremes, unpredictable weather and temperature, our intense sun, cool or cold nights, low humidity, and hail. So I do want to direct you to this very useful climate summary that we have. And may I just say that if for people who aren't speaking, can you please mute yourself, just because I'm hearing a little feedback, and it's helpful to everybody if you do mute yourself. Thank you. So anyway, so there's this very helpful summary that you can reach at the extension website, which is just the climate summary for Colorado Springs. And this is really very helpful because it not only tells you some, just averages in terms of temperatures and precipitation, but it gives you the chances for when we have the last frost in the spring and the first frost in the fall. And this is really important because you have tender plants that you might not be able to plant until you're pretty safe, you're pretty sure that we're going to have finished our last frost. So if you look at the 32-degree threshold, so that's just even a very light frost, we have about a 50% chance of still getting one, or having our last frost date be May 6th. And by the time we've gotten to May 18th, now we have a 90% chance of it being done. So we only have a 10% chance of frost after May 18th. And then same with the fall. So if we're going at that 32-degree threshold, we only have a 10% chance of a first frost by September 18th, but then by the time we get to October 18th, it's 90%. So this also just gives you the length of the frost-free days. And there's some typical, planting and harvesting dates that you can find. So this is really a helpful document that, again, you can find on the extension website. So just talking about weather in general, in spring, Colorado just has it fools you very easily. So we have these like lovely spring days, and everyone starts to think, oh, it's great, it's spring, and then we get snow. So this last week was a perfect example, right? We had some beautiful warm weather, and then we got a big snow. And so don't be fooled by the early warm-ups, because that is devastating to a garden and to a gardener. So really do wait until that average last frost date before you plant out things like tomatoes, or this is what your tomatoes are going to end up looking like. And also consider that there's the air temperature, but then there's the soil temperature. And because of the soil warms a lot more slowly than the air temperature. And so you actually want to make sure that even if you're planting cool season crops, that you want to dig down into the soil, because you might not even be able to get into your soil, even if like it's a lovely 60-degree day, but your soil still could be frozen. And so you kind of want to make sure that things are warm enough and the ground has thawed. You can sow some hardy vegetables, and we'll talk about those a little bit more later, but you can sow those usually in early April, even when both the air and the soil are cold. But frost sensitive vegetables, so things that are more tender, like squash or tomatoes or peppers, they need to have warm soil and air temperatures, and you don't want to be planting them until well into May, if not the end of May. And then on the other end of the season, in the fall, we can get some, early frosts. And so you have to kind of be paying attention to the forecast to make sure that, if your tomatoes don't get caught by surprise, and that you actually, either protect them or you take anything inside so that they don't turn to mush on you. And another weather-related event in Colorado is hail. We have big hailstorms. In fact, actually, it's our biggest insurance risk in Colorado, and the biggest insurance expense in Colorado is hailstorms, not wildfires like many people might expect. But the insurance companies actually pay out more money for roof damage, car damage. things like that. But it also really affects our vegetable gardens. And we can get hail anytime during the summer. And what hail does is it will just shred your plants. So a lot of times, if it really shreds your plants, your vegetables may not be able to recover, and you may just have to replant them. If it's early enough in the season. Obviously, if it's August, you may not be able to replant them. But particularly, some of the plants, like if they're not too badly damaged, you actually can just kind of harvest off the shredded parts, and they will regrow and replant. So you're just going to have to kind of watch what happens to your vegetable. Another thing that you could consider doing is using a shade cloth to protect your plants. So you just create a little structure, with some wood or whatever, and just put a shade cloth over the vegetables to stave off some of the hail. So we also have very intense sun in Colorado, and that's because we're higher in elevation than most of the other states in this country, and we also have very low humidity, and so that leads to just more sun getting through the atmosphere. And so things like that, or even that you'd consider to be full sun crops like basil, it can tolerate full sun, but it'll be happier with part shade, even though we often consider that to be a full sun crop. And lettuces will not be happy if you plant them in the full sun. And so this is a way that, that you could create like a little trellis for some of the vining crops, and then plant things like lettuce underneath them. Or you could plant, lettuce in the shade of a fence so that it's not getting the full blasting western sun, or under a tree, or someplace where it only gets a few hours of sun a day. But putting lettuce crops out in the full sun will be very hard on them. And even sun-loving plants like peppers, they can get sunburned if they are really sitting in sun and their leaves are not full enough to sort of protect the actual peppers themselves. And then also, if you put out just new seedlings in the springtime and you don't harden them off properly, they can get sun scorched as well. So we really have to take the sun into account when we are gardening. Another tip is just to plant your plants in the shade of taller plants. So if you had some tomatoes growing here, you could plant the lettuce in the shade of that tomato. Another thing to think about, so this is the length of our growing season, is that if you want to grow a particular vegetable, make sure that the growing season is long enough for what you want to grow. And so you can find this information out on the back of seed packets. It'll say how long it takes for a vegetable to mature. So in this particular case, we've got a tomato plant, and it says that it is 65 days to maturity. So that would be from when you plant the plant out in the springtime. But Colorado has cooler nights. And so that 65 days to maturity, that may have been, where they're growing the seed and selling it down in Arkansas or someplace like that has warmer nights. And so because of our cooler nights, we have a little bit of a delay in the maturation of the plants. And so we might have it may be 2 weeks later before we start to see some of the tomatoes ripen. So just because it says 65 days, it may be closer to 80 days in Colorado. Questions?
There was a question right when we started, if I can get back to it. Someone said, I just learned a little about Olla pots, O-L-L-A. Do you know much about that?
Yeah, so and I'll get to irrigation in a little bit, but the Oyas are an old technique for watering, and they can be good, especially when you're putting them. So an Oya pot is just a terracotta pot that you can fill with, so it has an opening, and you can fill it with water, and then it seeps out. So it's an unglazed terracotta pot. And so they can be shaped like this, or they can sometimes be shaped like this. And you plant them next to something like a tomato. And so basically what it does is just slow irrigates the water. It works well for plants that are like a tomato, or plants that are kind of side by side. And you could even plant like some lettuce around an Oya pot. However, it's not going to be, it will slow down and give some nice deep root watering, but it's not necessarily going to be, it's not like a vacation water or something like that. So if did that answer your questions on watering with Oyas?
Yes, and then
Okay.
we have a couple of other questions. Nico asked, so would taller plants go on the west side of the garden?
So it depends on what your goal is. So if you're trying to have all plants get full sun, then you'd actually want to have the taller plants on the north side of your garden, so they're not shading the other plants. If you want to use them as shade plants to protect your lettuce, and so if you want to use them as kind of for a sun, then you'd want to put them on the west side, and then you'd want to put the lettuce just to the east of the tomatoes, or so if you want to use them as a something to shade.
Okay. And the next question, if I find it, is, does every plant need some shade due to how intense the sun is, or just the ones you listed?
It's pretty much the ones I listed. So so a lot of plants, like squash and tomatoes and pumpkins and corn, and all those would actually prefer to have very full sun. So it's really when you're talking about the lettuces, greens, they would prefer to have a little bit less sun. But so it kind of depends on which group of plants you're talking about. So, but the majority of vegetables would prefer to have full sun, like herbs, carrots, onions, all those would prefer to have full sun.
The next question in chat is from Melissa, and she asked, what are some sun loving vegetables that won't be harmed by the intense sun?
So I think all the ones that I did just mention would, but you do with peppers. So they're peppers, you just want to make sure that there's a good leaf canopy on them. And so that would be the one, so they love full sun, but they need to have a nice full leaf canopy so that the actual peppers themselves don't get sun scalded.
And two more questions. Mari says, I'm very new to gardening. What plants would be my best opportunity for success? What are the best groupings?
I mean, for beginners, I would say growing some lettuces and some easy things that you can just direct seed. You can also buy lettuces at a garden center and just kind of plant them. If you have and it also kind of depends on whether you're you do have full sun or not. Another easy plant to grow is a summer squash, and then that usually is very productive and will give you some good, usually some pretty easy things to harvest. So yeah, so I would say some of the greens are easy, and then also they tend to they don't tend to get a lot of diseases or other kinds of things. So it's just a question more of watering them and but the tomatoes get to be a little bit trickier. So I think as a brand new gardener, I'm not sure that I would start off with tomatoes. I mean, you can always experiment. One of the things I always tell people is even if you're a new gardener, it's okay to kill plants sometimes because that's how you learn. And guess what? All of us who are now, gardeners have killed lots of plants. And so don't be afraid to, make some mistakes and learn from them. Okay, I'm going to move on just to, and then we can come back to some of the other questions. So now I want to talk about soil because, soil maybe not seem like the sexiest topic, but the soil problems will actually contribute to about 80% of all the problems in the garden. And so you really have to make sure that you do have good soil in your garden. And the first concept that we want to talk about is soil tilth. And that's just the ability of soil to support root growth. So that means it can, there's some, it's not compacted, it's got some organic matter. So just, it's good. And you can imagine plants can just, grow out their roots very easily. And unfortunately, Colorado often has poor soil tilth. So we have to make sure that we improve our soil tilth in order to be able to grow things successfully. So ideally, if you're starting a vegetable garden, you'd get a soil test. And those are about $35, and you can send them up to Colorado State University Soil Testing Lab, and the website is right there. You can also pick up, it's just a jar with the forms in it from our office. You still will send it up yourself, and then you'll get the results back in a few weeks. And that will tell you exactly what you need to add to your soil for the healthiest garden. But I do understand that $35 is a lot of money, and not everyone can spend that kind of money. So just some ways to, kind of think about gardening if you don't get a soil test would be, just get an idea of what your soil texture is. And that's just with the field test. So basically you just get, go out into your garden and dig up a little bit of the dirt and rub some of it between your fingers. So if it's a sandy soil, it's going to feel gritty, like you're at a beach. And if it's a silty, loamy soil, which is kind of our ideal soil, it's going to feel kind of nice and smooth, and you're going to, and you'll be able to put your hands into it very easily. And if it's a clay soil, that's going to feel sticky, and it's going to feel like, you might be able to, make a pot out of it. And so there's also the ribbon test, which is a little bit more, just so you get, quite moist soil. And then again, you kind of feel it, but then you also kind of squish it between your hands, like in this picture here. And so this would be, a clay soil because it's actually developing quite a nice long ribbon. Sandy soil wouldn't even form a ribbon because it would just kind of break apart because of the sand. And so, and then if it's, kind of a sandy clay loam, it's going to develop somewhat of a ribbon. And if it's a clay soil, it will really develop a nice long ribbon, as you squish it out. And so this is kind of a way that you can figure out, what soil type you're working with. And why this matters is that if you have a sandy soil, just know that it's not going to hold a lot of water, and it's not going to hold very many nutrients. And so those are just going to run right out of the soil. And so you're going to have to add things a little bit more frequently. If you have clay soil, that has poor drainage. And so it's going to hold water really well. And it will also hold nutrients really well. But you can get salt buildup from some of the fertilizers, and sometimes you'll end up with a shallow root just because of that clay soil. The good news is both of these can be amended with adding organic matter to the soil. So it kind of doesn't really matter if you have the sandy soils or the clay soils. So if you're adding organic matter, and what I mean by organic matter is things like compost, or you can even use a well-rotted manure if you have access to alpacas or horses or even cows. So you could add some of that, or you can buy commercial compost, or you can make compost in your own in your house from vegetable scraps, from your yard and from lawn clippings and other garden clippings. But you do want to add organic matter every year to the garden because organic matter in Colorado just leaches out of the soil. So we have to constantly be adding new organic matter so that it can either loosen those clay soils, or it can add the nutrient holding capacity to the sandy soils. And so you would want to add about 2 to 3 inches of plant-based compost. So if you're using, something like mushroom compost or plant-based compost you've made yourself, you can add 2 to 3 inches of that plant-based compost for every 6 to 8 inches of soil. So if I'm digging down about 6 or 8 inches, then I will just spread 2 to 3 inches of compost onto the top of my soil, and I'll dig it in. Now, if I'm digging deeper than that, if I'm going down 12 to 16 inches, then I could actually add more compost on top. So I could add 4 to 6 inches of compost on top. So you kind of see how that works. So the deeper you go, you can add more because you're kind of amending more of your soil. Now, if you're using an animal-based like manure, there's a potential for salt buildup just because there tends to be salts in the manures, and so you would add less manure to the. So you'd only add 1 inch for every 6 to 8 inches, just to avoid salt buildup. And notice that it's aged manure, so you never want to add fresh manure to a garden because you have the potential for getting like E. coli or other bacteria that could, if you put that on your lettuce garden, for example, if where you're growing lettuce, then the water splashing onto the manure could actually contaminate the lettuce and make you sick when you eat it. So you always want to use well-aged manure. So it wants to be a minimum of 6 months, better 8 months or even a year old. Another thing I want to caution you about is sometimes when people, if you have, lots of horses or lots of cows in a big area, a big pasture, some of the land managers will use herbicides to treat for weeds. And it doesn't hurt the animals, so they can eat the grass and everything that was treated with the herbicide, and it just passes through their system, and it passes intact through their system. And these herbicides can affect your vegetables, particularly things like legumes, so anything in the bean family or anything in the tomato family. That can be, very harmful for your vegetables. And so you get these weird, the way these look kind of just, it won't grow normally and it won't produce normally. And so you want to pay attention to this. There is a way you can test for it. So let's just say you had you have access to some place with manure. And so before you would put it into your garden, you want to do the bean test. And so basically what you do is you would just get a couple, 3-inch pots, and just fill them with some plain potting soil that you would just buy. So this is going to be your control. And so you would have 2 of these, and then you'd have 2 more pots where you'd fill them with a combination of that potting soil plus the manure. And then to both of these pots, you'd have 3 pea or bean seeds. You can use either one. Probably bean is a little bit easier. Just put them per pot and then put them in a nice sunny spot, water them. And then in a couple of weeks, just look to see whether you have some, whether the leaves look normal or whether they're starting to get these deformities to them. Because if they start to get deformities, you don't want to use that manure. If the leaves look nice, like these bottom leaves before, these were the leaves that were put out, from the seedling before they really started, taking up things from the soil. So if you have nice, normal looking beans, then you can use that manure. So that's a way to test for herbicide persistence, even without a fancy test. You can just make sure that you're not using something. Because if you put this herbicide, if you put manure with herbicide down, it's going to take a few years before it will break down in your garden in order for you to be able to use that. Another thing with soils is to make sure that you don't compact them. So every time you step on a garden soil, you will compact it a lot. And then you won't have good tilth for the root system. So you want to have everything be as easy as possible for the root system. And so what you want to do is establish permanent beds. So this can either be, in-ground beds like this, or it can be, raised beds, which I'll talk about in just a second. And never walk on these beds. So just have permanent pathways in between them. And then another thing that you don't want to do is work the soils if they're wet. So if we've had a nice snow and you're starting to get all excited about gardening in the springtime, and the soils are still pretty wet, you're just going to cause compaction. So you have to wait until the soils dry out a little bit. And that would be especially true if you do have clay soils. So you might want to consider, having, creating raised beds in your garden, and there's definitely some advantages to them. If you have clay soils, having the raised beds will help give you better drainage. You don't have to till them as much because you're not going to be compacting and walking on them, and so you're not going to be bringing more weeds up to the surface. And again, because you're not going to be walking on them, you're not going to be compacting the soil. And you can add things that might be a little bit easier to add, some row covers or fences or cold frames around them. And if you have critters that are in the ground, like pocket gophers or voles, you can actually put something, a metal mesh on the bottom to keep critters from eating your soil. So depending on where you live, you may or may not have critters that want to eat all your plants. So, you can make raised beds out of lots of different things. You can make them from wood. You can make them from, these grow bags that you can buy. You can, basically, have just large containers. You can make them from concrete blocks, or you can buy, some commercial kits. They should be at least 6 inches deep. And if you're, ideally even deeper would be better. And if you're going to grow things like carrots or potatoes, you want them to be 18 inches deep. So you kind of want to know what you're growing. So that if you're just growing lettuce and greens, you could probably get away with 6 inches. But if you're growing things like tomatoes or some of the bigger plants, you want to have them be 12 inches. And know that the soils are different for raised beds and containers. So it's a different kind of soil than you would have with your in-ground bed. And so you actually would want to make sure that the reason that they're different for raised beds is because you need to keep them a little bit lighter, and they need to have a little bit more drainage. So the soil structure will be different in a raised bed than it will be in ground. And so so you could, if you're trying to fill a raised bed, if you use about 4 inches of your existing soil that was in the area, and then you can buy 3 inches of garden soil. Or if you can't find garden soil around, you could use 3 more inches of your existing soil. And then you want to make sure that you add a bunch more soil amendments. So, and you could add things like perlite or vermiculite in order to add a little bit more drainage and just kind of fluff up the soil a little bit. Actually, maybe I should take some questions here. Jan, are there any questions?
Yes, I'm going to go back to Janine's question. She asked, how does a greenhouse affect the additional 14 days for the time needed in the growing season?
So greenhouses are going to, generally speaking, they will not cool off as rapidly at night. And so you may have faster development just because you're not going to get the cooler nights. Plus, you're going to get some warmer temperatures during the day. The one thing I would say to be cautious of is that greenhouses, with our intense sun, they can become like a little bit of an oven. And so just make sure that they're well ventilated and that they have some automatic ventilation if you're going to grow them during the summertime, because if you're going to use your greenhouse during the summertime, it's a little bit less, it's not going to be quite as bad in the springtime and the fall. But if you're trying to grow things in a greenhouse in the summer, it has to be well ventilated and it has to be automatic, because if you're at work and it becomes 90 degrees outside, all the plants in your greenhouse are going to die. Are there other questions?
Yes, I'm sorry. I was muted and I thought I could press my space bar and unmute myself, but it wasn't working.
No worries.
Mari asked, what is the best way to handle blossom end rot? And I posted the plant talk and the fact sheet about those, but you might want to talk about.
That's great. Yeah. So blossom end rot can be caused by two things. And one is, and we'll get a little bit more to tomatoes at the end. So actually, can we hold that question until we get to the end with the tomatoes?
Yes. And then Carolyn asks, do you have to dig in the organic matter and how deep? And you sort of answered that, but just reiterate?
Yeah, so you do want to dig in the organic matter rather than, so even, so the first time particularly that you put in a garden, you do want to dig it in. If you want to go with the complete no-till method, you'd want to wait a full year after you add the organic matter before planting, which most people don't have that kind of patience. So if you want to, add organic matter and garden this year, you actually do want to dig it in. So it doesn't, because you do want to mix it into the soil rather than have it, be just sitting on top. But if you do wait for a full year, there are the organic matter will kind of leach down and the earthworms will, help bring the matter down, but you have to wait a year.
Okay, Melissa asks, what plants benefit from large pots planted on their own, isolated from other plants versus a bigger raised bed space?
I don't think it matters that much. I would actually just say what works to you, what works for you in your garden and, what you want to grow. So I would say that that's more of a practicality rather than a, like there's no plant that needs to be all the way off by itself. Let me put it that way. So, so I would say if you've got a big container and you're growing one tomato and you want to put that big tomato in that container, great. But if you can also mix and match. I mean, you don't have to grow, you could grow tomatoes and peppers and other kinds of things in one raised bed. So I would just say, do the layout and what works for you in your raised bed versus your containers, and just whatever works.
Okay, Steph says, I'm building beds this year. Last year I used containers. Can I use the potting soil from my containers in my new raised bed? I got some powdery mildew last year. Will it contaminate my new bed?
I would say you probably could use that soil in your new beds. I would not grow the same, I would be careful not to grow the same vegetables that got powdery mildew because some vegetables are more susceptible. So I would kind of pay attention to where you're putting the soil. And if you're putting the soil into this bed, say, okay, this is the bed that I put the soil in and it had some powdery mildew, so I'm not going to grow summer squash in this bed. I'm going to grow greens that don't really get powdery mildew or corn or something like that. You do want to rejuvenate that, you do want to add some compost or manure or something to that soil because it will be a little bit depleted.
Okay, and then Steph also asks, will shade cloth at night help keep it warmer at night?
I would say there's something called a floating row cover, which can be very helpful. And that's like just this white spun polyester cloth that you can get at garden centers, or sometimes you can buy it online. And that does, that will help keep in a little bit of warmth at night, but it will also allow light through. So I guess it depends on your goals. So if you're trying to grow lettuce in intense sun and you want some shade cloth to cut the sun, you could use the shade cloth. But if you're trying to grow things that want sun, then you might want to consider using a floating row cover. They're not going to increase the warmth at night a lot. It'll just be a few degrees warmer.
Okay, and that's all, Irene.
All right. Okay, so let's move on to watering. So in Colorado, we've got some, pretty intense sun, as we talked about already, but we also don't get rains all that often. And we, again, have low humidity, which all leads to very high evapotranspiration, very high evaporation. And so we have to water frequently. So if you've come from some other, from the east where, the rain just takes care of it for you, well, Colorado is a different story and you're going to have to water a lot. And if you have a seed bed, so let's just say you've sown out some lettuce into your seed bed, you're going to need to water that sometimes up to 3 times a day. You're not going to have to give it a lot of water, but that top little layer, so imagine the seed is sitting in the soil and it doesn't have big roots yet. And so it's just starting to send out some leaves. That top little layer of the soil that the seed is sitting in is going to dry out very, very quickly by the sun. And so you're going to have to water it, 1 to 3 times a day just to keep it growing until it gets a bigger root system and it can survive and get a little bit more water. So the seeds really need serious watering. Also, if you're growing in containers, so they will need to be watered a little bit more frequently than gardens that are in ground. And even raised beds will need to be watered a little bit more frequently than in-ground beds, just because, again, they have a little bit better drainage and they're a little bit higher. So always be thinking about how much, that you're going to have to water quite frequently with a vegetable garden. And when you're watering, water by need, not just on a schedule, because the weather changes all the time. And so really your very best way to find out whether a plant needs water is to use your finger. And so you just put it into the soil about up to the second knuckle. And then if you're feeling some nice moisture, it may not need watering. But if you put your finger in and it feels dry, all the way down to, like this part feels dry, you definitely need to be watering. Another thing you can look for is, if your plants are starting to wilt, that's usually a sign that they need watering. Every once in a while on a very hot day, plants will just kind of wilt a little bit. And if they perk back up at night, that means that they probably, were doing okay. And they were just kind of, it's almost a way of a plant to rest in intense sun and heat. But if they perk back up at night, then they may not, that's a good watering schedule. If they stay wilted when the sun starts to go down, that means they absolutely need watering. So in general, you're going to have to water a little bit more frequently during the mid-season when we're hitting the 80s and 90s on a regular basis. Also, if it's windy, that just sucks the water right out of the soil. So in the early part of the season, you may not have to water as much. Or if we happen to get a nice rainy spell, you may not need to be watering your plants at all. Or if it's cloudy for an extended period of time, you may not have to water as often. So it's much better to just be out there monitoring your plants, looking to see what's going on, and watering according to the needs of the plants. So the simplest options, for watering would just be, to go out there with a hose or a watering can, and just water your plants by hand. You can also just use a sprinkler attached to a hose. And so that would be the simplest way, to get water to your vegetable garden. I do want to point out, though, if you are overhead watering with a sprinkler or a hose, that can lead to some diseases, particularly things like powdery mildew. Can be carried off on the splash from the water, and so you can go from one plant to another or from one leaf to another. And then also the same thing can happen with tomato viruses, that the spores and the viruses can actually be carried by water. So just kind of pay attention to that. And if you are going to water with overhead watering, it's better to water in the early part of the day so that the plants have time to dry off before nightfall, when they would stay wet all night, and then the diseases could spread more easily. A great option, especially since we're moving to watering restrictions in Colorado Springs, would be to use a drip or soaker irrigation. And it can be a little bit of an expensive startup, but it saves you a lot of money on water. And if you put some mulch on, you can end up reducing your water use by 50%. So it would fairly quickly pay for itself. So that is something to consider. And then consider using mulch, because this will help conserve moisture. It also will not leave an open spot for weeds to sprout. And it will encourage things like earthworms. It'll help keep the soil from getting as hot. And so if you are mulching, you want to make sure that you're using seed-free material. So you could use a weed-free straw. You could use grass clippings that from your lawn, but make sure that you're not using herbicides on them, because the vegetables are sensitive to that. Or you could use shredded leaves, or even a very finely shredded bark like this. So that can really help. Another option would be to plant your plants very closely together. So plant them kind of in blocks rather than rows where you have each plant just with a lot of soil space around it, because that then the plants themselves kind of help. They act like a living mulch, and they can provide shade for the roots that can reduce evaporation. It can maximize your yield, because you're actually putting a lot more plants in a smaller area. And so it can just overall reduce your labor. So that is a good way to reduce your water use. Now, fertilizing your plants. So again, if you got a soil test, that will tell you, particularly which nutrients your plants need. But again, if you haven't gotten a soil test, just know that in Colorado, the soils tend to be low in nitrogen. That's pretty much universal. And they often are low in phosphorus. So when you're talking about garden fertilizers, there's always 3 numbers on the package. And this first one is nitrogen, the second one is phosphorus, and the third one is potassium. And so you want to make sure that, and so basically if you don't have a garden test that tells you you need this much nitrogen to add to your garden, then kind of a rule of thumb that you can use is if you get a generic fertilizer like, that just has, 10, 10, 10 for the numbers, you could just apply 1 pound of that to, per 100 feet of row. Or if you had, if you found a fertilizer that has numbers 5, 10, 5, then you could add 2 pounds of those. So basically, normally you want to have a higher amount of nitrogen, just because a lot of vegetables require a lot of nitrogen and our soils tend to be low in nitrogen. When you're dealing with fertilizers, there's 2 kinds. So there's either time release fertilizers, which break down a little bit more slowly and last longer, or you can get a water soluble fertilizer. So with a time release fertilizer, you'd actually add it to the soil before planting, and then you'd get a little bit would be released every time you water. If you have a water soluble fertilizer, you put it into your watering can and according to package directions, and then you'd be using it on your plants about every 2 to 3 weeks. So it just kind of depends on what you can find, what's a good price, and what's going to work best for you. And then before we get to the specific vegetables, just make sure that you keep track of what you're planting, because you may think I'm just going to remember this all, but you won't. And so just have a chart, have something so that I planted this there, I planted on this day. So just keep paying attention. And then also, especially if you're planting by seed, know what your plant is supposed to look like, so that way you won't pull it up thinking it's a weed, or you won't leave a weed thinking it's your plant. And then another thing is not to plant everything all at once. So if you're planting lettuce or basil, you could plant them several times during the summer, and then that will keep them all from maturing at once. And then also it'll give you some in reserve in case we get a devastating hailstorm. Okay, so any questions there?
Yes. Can you use pine needles for mulch? Carolyn asks.
You can. You could use them lightly. What you don't want to do is get a really thick mat of pine needles, because they can kind of sometimes weave themselves together, and then water won't get through. So if you have a very light amount of pine needles, that will work, but you don't want to get them really thick.
And Heloisa asks, rain barrel water, is rain barrel water good for veggie growing?
Yeah, so it partly depends on whether, like on your rain barrel. So if your rain barrel tends to accumulate a lot of algae, or you don't use it, very regularly, you can end up with some, just not high quality water. Also, if you have a newer roof, and we don't get very frequent rains, you can actually kind of get an accumulation of some of the chemicals from the, just the asphalt and the other chemicals that are in a roof. And then if it doesn't rain very frequently to sort of, wash those out, you can end up with, a little bit of more high concentrations than you might want for some of your vegetable gardens. So I would say that if you have, if you're using rain barrels to supplement your water usage, I would use the rain barrel water for flowers and shrubs and trees more than I would for the, if you also then have access to a faucet, use the faucet for your vegetable garden and use your rain barrels for other things. It's not to say you can't. You could use, your rain barrel water, just that you have to pay more attention.
Megan asks, I put in a thin layer of straw at the end of last season in a raised bed. Should I collect this straw from the top of the soil before planting in the spring or leave it on the soil surface?
I would collect the straw off because, just to help warm up your soil, like a couple days before you mean to plant. It's actually kind of nice to leave it on there until you're getting close to plant, because that will preserve some soil moisture. But you do want to warm up your soil a little bit before planting. And then also then you can reserve, so you can just kind of put it off to the side, plant, and then put it back on as a mulch.
Okay, two more quick questions. We'll let you get back to the veggies.
Okay.
In containers or raised beds, is it necessary or recommended to introduce earthworms?
No, you do not need to. It's neither. It's if they happen to get in, it's fine, but you don't need to introduce them. So typically, there's other processes. You can, if you're adding organic matter to your soil on a fairly regular basis, then that will sort of help promote all the microbial activity, but they're not required. They're not an absolute necessary part of a garden.
Okay, and then Carolyn says, I live at 7,250 feet. Will that altitude make a difference in what veggies I can grow?
Yeah, so remember how I said that, cooler nights make things take longer. So at 7,200 feet, you're going to have even cooler nights. And so you might have even slower ripening. And so you might want to be adding a whole month on to so you may not be able to do things as easily. Like some tomatoes may not ripen in time for you, or you might not get enough, heat to grow things like a watermelon or something like that. And so, you definitely will have a shorter growing season and you'll have cooler nights. And so you'll have an effectively even shorter growing season. Jan, if you could find the vegetable garden basics for the mountain fact sheet, if you could put that in, that will be helpful.
Okay, I will do that. And then that's
right.
That's the last one if you want to keep going.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so just now talking about specific vegetables. So, kind of know that vegetables are classified into hardy, half hardy, tender, and very tender. And then you don't want to plant them at the wrong time. So hardy vegetables can survive a freeze, a frost, or, even a couple day cold snap. So you can plant them earlier. So even though it's not technically our frost-free season, you could actually plant them out in late April when we might still have danger of some frost, because they can tolerate that. So things like broccoli, Brussels sprouts, radish, cabbages, collard, kale, kohlrabi, leeks, onions, peas, and spinach can all tolerate those. So you could plant all of those in late April. If they're a little bit less hardy, they can tolerate an hour or two of frost. And so you might be able to plant them as soon as early May. And things like cauliflower, celery, chard, chicory, Chinese cabbage, endive, and lettuce will all fall into that group. Things that are more tender can be injured by, some sort of frost. And so you want to make sure that you're waiting until after that May 15th, May 18th day, because they're just not going to be able to tolerate any degree of frost. And so things like beans, corn, eggplants, and tomatoes fall into that group. And very tender vegetables, you want to wait well until the end of May, because they can't tolerate frost, but they also need really warm soils, and they can't handle the cool winds. So this is things like cucumbers, melon, squash, eggplants, and peppers. So just a quick breeze through of some of the vegetables, because really once you know these principles, it's going to be much easier for you to grow them. So we're just going to kind of, blast through these a little bit quickly. But so root vegetables, things like radishes, beets, carrots, turnips, and rutabagas, they tend to prefer cooler weather. And so you can actually plant them a little bit earlier. But because they're roots, they have all of their, all their production is below ground. You have to have some really good tilth in your soil So it has to be nice and loose. It has to be an organic rich in order to grow, really healthy vegetable crops. And they are not going to do well if they dry out. So they will, have pretty poor quality if you let them dry out. And they also can tolerate some frost at the end because, again, we're harvesting the part that's underground. And so sometimes they'll get even sweeter, even if the top parts of the vegetables have been nipped by a frost. You can still harvest them and you might enjoy them even more. Cole crops, things like broccoli, cabbage, kale, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, and cauliflower, all, again, prefer a little bit cooler weather. So you can plant them a little bit early. They're usually in that half-hardy stage. And they will, so that you do want to be planting them in either the springtime or you can plant them at, towards the fall for a fall crop. But they do prefer that cool weather and they won't grow quite as well in the heat of the summer. You will need to water them very regularly so that they don't get bitter. So imagine, kale or broccoli just that has a lot of that really kind of bitter flavor to them. That would be because you're not watering them enough. They do like full sun, but they can tolerate some shade. So that would be, a plant that could be planted under a shade cloth. And they do prefer well-amended and loose soil. That's really the story for most vegetables. So a well-amended, and again, by amended, we are adding the organic matter. And we want it to be nice and loose. You do want to fertilize cole crops twice. So once before planting and then once again mid-season. And that's just going to give them the best growth and the best flavor. And you can grow them either from seeds, like things like kale or the kohlrabi or, cauliflower or even some of the broccoli. You can, just direct seed in your garden. Things like Brussels sprouts take a little bit longer. And so you might want to either buy them in the garden center or grow them yourself in your house and then plant them later. Greens, there's a whole variety of greens. In fact, actually, this could be, I could make this list even longer, but things like arugula, lettuce, spinach, Swiss chard, mustard greens, collard greens, like I was talking with Melissa before we started. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of greens. And again, they prefer the cooler weather, so you can start them a little bit earlier, and then you can harvest them earlier. And so, so you either plant them in the springtime or you plant them in the fall. They're not going to be as happy in the middle of the summer. And again, they're not going to be, if they're allowed to dry out, you're going to not get a very good quality crop. They're pretty nitrogen hungry, so you want to make sure that there is some, good nitrogen in your soil. And the nice thing about all of these greens is that you can harvest them, pretty young. So you don't have to wait very long as a gardener. You can plant them and then you can be harvesting them even when they just come up, and you can kind of snip them. There's a technique called the cut and come again, where you let them grow, you snip them off with the scissors, and then they will regrow. So that can be a way that you can just, keep harvesting some nice young greens for quite some time. And then peas, so again, they're cool season crops, so they will be happier if you plant them early. So they're in that really hardy section. You can plant them in April, mid-April even. But here's a trick. They actually prefer to germinate warm. So you can actually put them in a little moist paper towel in a Ziploc bag in your house and let them germinate for a couple days inside, and then plant them out in the yard where they'll be happy to grow in the cooler weather. So they're a little bit crazy that way. They do need to be trellised, so they need to have some sort of something to climb up in order to not, be sprawling on the ground. But because they are in the bean family, they don't need to be fertilized. So they will actually add nitrogen to the soil rather than taking nitrogen away from the soil. So that can be a nice thing to do. If you're growing something, if you grow lettuce one year, growing peas in that same area, the next year can actually return the nitrogen from the soil that the lettuce took. Or, doing crop rotation like that is a really good idea, just because, you don't get diseases built up, but then also, the plants will take up different kinds of nutrients from the soil. And sometimes you can do things like using peas or beans to help replenish the soil of nitrogen. So things like beans and cucumbers are tender binding vegetables, so we want to be planting them, now out after May 15th or even at the end of May because they are frost sensitive. Both of them could get powdery mildew. So again, think about that overhead watering, and then also give them some airspace. So don't plant them too crowded together. Give them some airspace so that there's less chance of the first of the fungus to develop, and then second to go from one plant to the other. You want to pick them fairly regularly because that will keep them productive. So if you just let beans or cucumbers hang on the vines and you don't pick them off, they will stop producing. So you want to keep picking them in order to keep harvesting them. And both of them do need to be trellised. Summer squash, that's another tender plant. So you want to plant it after May 15th. It will be happiest in full sun. You do want to fertilize it somewhat regularly because it's a heavy producing plant, and you want to harvest it regularly to keep it producing. If you can pick them when they're about this size, they'll grow to this size, but they're not going to be very tasty in your garden anymore. So pick them when they're small, and they're going to be much tastier. And then summer squash is also prone to powdery mildew. So either don't overhead irrigate or irrigate early in the morning so that the plants don't develop that powdery mildew. And everyone knows the jokes about summer and people dropping off zucchini on their neighbors' doors. And so don't plant more than you are going to happily eat unless you have some place that you can donate your produce. And then plants that are in the nightshade family, they like peppers, tomatoes, eggplants, and tomatillos. Again, these are very frost sensitive, so wait until after May 15th or even towards the end of May to plant out in the garden. And these, because they require a longer growing season than Colorado has, you have to plant them from transplant. So you can't plant them from seed in the garden. You can grow your seed indoors, 6 to 8 weeks before the last frost date, or you can buy them at the garden center, but you can't grow them from seed in the garden. So these plants are nitrogen sensitive. If you give them too much nitrogen, they're not going to either flower, they will probably just grow green parts, and they're not going to flower or set fruit. So if you're going to fertilize them, you want to have a higher phosphorus content and a little bit lower nitrogen content. And so you can actually even find specific tomato fertilizer that would be good for your tomatoes. Or just look for, again, when we talked about the numbers on the bag, look for a lower first number if you're going to be fertilizing nightshade plants. Tomatoes can either be determinate or indeterminate. So determinate tomatoes grow to a set height and they'll set all their fruit at one time. So that's a good choice if you're growing in a container because it's just not going to get really huge. And you can even pick some of the smaller varieties that will grow, really happily in containers. And there's a lot of tomatoes that are, actually say this is a good patio variety. Indeterminate tomatoes will just keep growing and flowering and setting fruits all the way until frost kill them. And that can be great if you want to have maximum production and you have, a good place that you can put them. But you are going to have to trellis the tomatoes. So you want to train them, on a fence, or, there's even some fancy ways that you can train them to go up wires or strings. Or you can cage them. So, either way. And then with the indeterminate tomatoes, you do want to kind of remove some of the suckers because that, they can get so densely growing that you don't get a lot of airflow in there and you can get easy virus transfer. So you kind of want to remove some of the vegetation once they get to be a decent height. If you're going to grow some of the larger tomatoes, like some of the heirloom tomatoes or even a large indeterminate tomato, you have to use a really big, sturdy and tall cage. A lot of those little wimpy cages you see in the garden centers, they might work nicely for your determinate tomato in a container, but they're not going to work well for, a big beefy heirloom tomato. And again, with the caging, you want to be cutting off those lower leaves just to keep, especially viruses can transfer from the soil to the lower leaves. And so if you cut off those lower leaves, once the plant gets about 2 feet tall, then that will reduce the viruses from transmitting to your tomatoes. So again, as I keep saying, you want to plant well after Mother's Day. And if you do want to cheat and go a little bit early, you could, there's these things called, wall waters or water teepees. There's a variety of different brands, and the water will help insulate the tomatoes. So you might be able to cheat and put them out a little bit early. But, don't get tempted to plant them out too early, because even just a week of cooler daytime temperatures, which we'll get some nice warm temperatures, and then we'll get a cool spell, and that will permanently stunt your plants. And so you're not going to get, you're trying to get a jump on your yield. Well, you'll actually get less yield. The other thing, though, is they don't like the really high temperatures, so they won't set fruit if the temperatures are above 90, unless you get one that's, a heat tolerant tomato. So just know that they kind of are a little bit of a Goldilocks plant. And again, as I mentioned, you remove the lower leaves once they get 2 feet tall to, just help with disease, and then just continually monitor for diseases. And so if you're seeing like a leaf that's getting brown or has yellowed spots, just remove those leaves and throw them away. So don't compost them, because that can, cause the virus to go into your compost. And then, monitor for fall frost, because they're going to probably be producing right up into that fall frost. And so you can pick any ripening fruit and green tomatoes, and then just ripen them on your counter. And then eggplant and peppers, those are still in the nightshade family. So we've got a variety that will do well. And so again, they need to be grown from seeds, from transplants. So you can either start your seeds indoors or buy them at the garden center. And they really have to have that warm soil and warm nighttime temperatures. So the nighttime temperatures have to be above 55 degrees. So watch out for those 40 to 50 degrees nights in May and June here. So this is my last slide. Oh, actually, I've got one final one, but there's some resources for you. So there's a Colorado vegetable guide, which is really helpful, that you can get on the extension website, the vegetable growing guide. And so if you just do vegetable growing guide extension, or Colorado vegetable growing guide Colorado extension, you would find this. And it's going to be really helpful to give you all the information that I just shared, and with more vegetables. And then there's also, we have a website, the Grow and Give website, which, if you end up with too much garden produce, you can donate your produce to people who need food. And but there's also, so that's not, it will hook you up with how to donate your produce, but it will also, there's a page, the Grow page has a lot of information on growing plants. There's little videos, there's all kinds of good stuff on that. And so that is another great resource if you're just getting started with vegetable gardening. And so also, and if Jen, if you could please type it into the chat, if you're having problems with vegetables as you're going along in the summertime, you can always email the help desk at Colorado State University. And so that's csumg2@elpasoco.com. And we will answer your vegetable garden classes, your questions. All right, any other questions?
Yes. Have to go back just a second. Elisa asks, which plants do we not plant all at once? Lettuce, herbs?
Yeah, so I would say things like lettuce, any greens, especially herbs like cilantro that will, kind of fizzle out pretty soon. So you'd want to plant all of those in succession. You could plant all your tomatoes out at once, because they do need that longer growing season. But, so you could plant kale, all those things, just, you could kind of succession plant so that they will, lettuce, all those things that you suggested would be good to sort of plant in like every 2 weeks or every month in your garden.
What other herbs can I grow in a grow bag other than basil from seed?
From seed. So you could grow parsley, you could grow dill, you could grow fennel, you could grow cilantro. Trying to think of So most of the annual herbs would be fine. So the things that aren't going to work out so well would be in a grow bag would be like thyme and rosemary, sage, those kinds of things, just because they won't overwinter as well in a grow bag. So I would say pretty much any annual herb.
Okay. And are black beans, turtle beans considered and grown like bush beans?
Yeah, so the dried beans would be grown very similarly to bush green beans. So usually bush beans you harvest at the green bean stage. So black beans you harvest when they're dry. So it's going to take more time because you're harvesting the green beans earlier. So you definitely would want to be planting them in full sun as soon as the ground gets warm, because they will take most of the summer to get to that dried stage, but otherwise it would be very similar.
And Lisa asks if there's a Facebook group, so I'm posting the link to that because yes, there is. Stephanie asks, can you hand pollinate yellow squash from a zucchini flower without affecting the quality of the yellow squash?
You can't, if you're not getting squash, because you don't have bees around to do the pollinating for you, yes, you can. So you'd have to figure out the difference between the male flowers and the female flowers and get the pollen from the male flowers and put it on the female flower in order to get in order to have a fertile squash develop. So, and you can tell the difference. The female flowers have like a little baby squash underneath the flower, so you can almost see it. So it's in bud, and then it has like this little swelling at the bottom. I hope you can see my hands here. It has a little swelling at the bottom that would be the baby flower. So that's the female flower, and then the male flower won't have that. And always in the beginning of the season, you have mostly male flowers, and then you start to get the female flowers later. Usually bees will pollinate it for you, but if you don't have any bees, you certainly can hand pollinate.
Okay, and then Patty asks about instruction for growing potatoes, and I posted information. I can't remember what it was, garden notes, I think. And then Roxanne raised her hand. So I don't know, Roxanne, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Maybe. Do you have any tips about growing potatoes that might?
I mean, I think most of the potato, so you just want to make sure that you have good, well-amended soil. You can plant them early; they're tough. So you could be planting potatoes in mid to late April, and then a tip with potatoes is plant them in a trench, and then as the leaves grow up, then hill them up, because the potatoes actually kind of grow on top of each other. So the more you hill it up, then the potatoes will grow under that layer of soil.
Okay, and Roxanne said she didn't have a question.
Oh, okay, great.
And I think that is all for the questions.
Okay, and we're 15 minutes over, so I apologize for going over. We had lots of good questions, which is wonderful. It always takes a little bit more time, but I'm happy that you were asking the questions.
Thank you, Irene.
You
that
are
was
welcome.
really informative. I learned a few things. And then I wanted to just let everyone know that Irene will be back on April 6th.
Actually, we have a different master gardener who's going to be.
Oh.
Yeah. So, but yeah. So, but thank you.
Oh, well, Irene won't be back, but we will have another gardening program on April 6th at noon for Xeriscape. And
and I'm sorry, it's also water-wise gardening. So just some people hear the word xeriscape and they think zero-scape. And so we're kind of going with the term water-wise, just because, but everyone wants to be saving water now. So that will be the next program.
You're getting lots of compliments, Irene, of course.
Oh, great.
I put a link in the chat to the Xeriscaping or Waterwise program if you want to sign up for that. And yes, this has been recorded and it will be posted on the PPLD YouTube page in the next few days.
And then Melissa, I think you posted some links to the books that people can check out at the library.
Yes, I did vegetable gardening, raised bed gardening, and I can't remember the other one. Container gardening, that's what it was.
Great.
And Irene and Melissa, I don't know what arrangements you made, but somebody asked about the slide deck. Are you sharing that or just the video?
Just the videos.
Okay.
All right, there's no other questions, so we will go ahead and wrap it up. And thank you again, Irene, and thank you, Victoria. And hopefully we'll see you on April 6th for the Xeriscaping or Waterwise program. Thank you. Bye, everyone.